given the opportunity to ask them. It's also important that you keep your microphone muted during the program, unless you're asking a question, of course. And one practical thing regarding the layout, if you wish to have the best view or the speaker's view, make sure to go to the 3 dots at the bottom right and select Change Layout and select Spotlight. This will ensure that you will see the person who is speaking during the panel discussion. Well, I hope that these announcements are all clear for you, and then I would very much like to move on to introducing our special guest. We are honored to first of all welcome Dr. Kai Hebel. He is an assistant professor of international relations at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Previously, he has studied political science, international relations, peace and conflict studies, and cultural studies at, among other things, Berkeley and Oxford University, earning him 3 masters and a doctoral degree. Our second speaker of today is Dr. Sean Mcfade. He began his career as a paratrooper and officer in the US Army's 82nd Airborne Division. Mcfade then became a private military contractor and paramilitary. In his occupation, he dealt with African warlords, raised armies for US interests, rode with armed groups in the Sahara, and helped prevent an impending genocide in the Rwanda region. Mcfade currently works as a professor of strategy at the National Defense University and Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He's also a senior fellow of the Atlantic Council, and he is an advisor to Oxford University. In addition, he is also very famous for his novels based on his own military experiences and his highly accredited non-fiction books about, among other things, the future of warfare and private military companies. And last, but certainly not least, is our third guest of today, Dr. Jelena Aparak. She is the chairperson rapporteur of the United Nations Human Rights Council Working Group on the Use of Mercenaries. Dr. Aparak has previously given lectures and conferences at academic institutions around the world and has contributed as an independent expert to various intergovernmental discussions on issues related to international peace and security. She has also participated in drafting several complaints against corporations and worked as a consultant. Previously, as a field worker and legal advisor for Médecins Sans Frontières, Dr. Aparak worked in conflict areas such as South Sudan, Chad, Darfur, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Central African Republic. But we are very glad to have such distinguished speakers on board today to address the important topic of private military companies. And to begin with, we shall now move on to the introductory statements. And I would very much like to give the floor to Dr. Kai Hebel to kick off today's program with the first introductory statement.
Thank you very much indeed, Sibren, for the introductory words and also for the invitation to speak today. Thank you also to the other organizers that made today's event possible. I very much look forward to the discussion and the interactions with my esteemed fellow panelists, Sean and Jelena. So the organizers have asked me to say a few introductory words to help situate the debate about private military companies. This I'm very happy to do, partly because it gave me the excuse to reread Machiavelli's The Prince. And so the first point that I would like to make today is that private military agents, mercenaries, have been an important part of the practice of world politics, as well as the thinking about world politics for several centuries. So in The Prince, written almost exactly 500 years ago, Niccolo Machiavelli had this to say about mercenaries. Mercenaries are useless and dangerous. If one holds his state based on these arms, he will stand neither firm nor safe, for they are disunited, ambitious, and without discipline, unfaithful, valiant before friends, cowardly before enemies. They have neither the fear of God nor fidelity to men. And destruction is deferred as long as the attack is. For in peace, one is robbed by them, and in war by the enemy. The fact is, they have no other
I'm sorry, Kayabo, you are muted, apparently.
Excellent. Thanks for letting me know. It's one of the pleasures of online events under COVID. So I'm going to start off again by just thanking the presenters and saying that I very much look forward to the discussion. One of the joys will be to interact with Sean.
Apparently, you were just in the citation. You were describing the fidelity of the mercenaries around that plot, and then it just was very recent lookout.
Oh, I see. Good. Thank you that I don't have to reread what I just read. So there are a couple of objections that we can raise about Machiavelli's scathing critique of mercenaries. One is that maybe he was talking only about armies that solely rely on mercenaries, right? So if you rely wholly for your security on mercenaries, maybe that was something that he criticized. But then a little bit later in The Prince, he goes on to say that he talks about the French armies, and he says that their armies were mixed, partly mercenary and partly national. And he didn't like that very much either, saying that nothing can be so uncertain or unstable as fame or power not founded on its own strength. Armies should be composed of citizens, not mercenaries. So even when it comes to mixed forces, Machiavelli's verdict was very negative. Now another objection is to say that he personally suffered at the hands of mercenaries, so maybe he had a personal bone to pick. And while I wouldn't completely discount this as one reason for his negative attitude towards mercenaries, I do think that one of the greatest political minds of his time probably wasn't solely influenced by a personal vendetta. There are some general fundamental objections that he raised against private military operators / mercenaries that we should take seriously today. So that's the first point, right? For hundreds of years, mercenaries have been an important part of the thinking as well as the practice of world politics. So now I would like to zoom in, following the invitation by the organizers to sketch some of the outlines of the debate that we're having today about private military companies. And I think the starting point has to be that in large parts of the world for the 19th and the 20th centuries, these centuries were the age of citizen armies, based in many cases on mass national conscription. So over the 19th and 20th century, a norm against the use of mercenaries emerged. The legitimate use of deadly force was conventionally seen as the supreme and the exclusive prerogative of the nation state, not of private companies and their employees. It was citizens who were supposed to fight and die for the love of country, not for the love of cash. So mercenaries did remain commonplace in the armies of Europe until the late 19th century, but then they largely disappeared. In the 1960s and the 1970s, the norm against mercenaries was codified politically and legally. For example, in 1976, the UN General Assembly issued a famous resolution on the right to self-determination. In that 1976 resolution, the General Assembly stated that using mercenaries against national liberation movements is a criminal act, and that mercenaries themselves are criminals. This norm against mercenaries also was echoed in scholarship. Stephen Krasner, one of the leading IR scholars at the time, wrote in 1989 that the norm against hiring mercenaries was so great that the US could not simply, quote, buy a regiment or two of Gurkhas. Similarly, in 1994, another important scholar, Janice Thompson, wrote, "Today, real states do not use private force." And it was not just academics, but also political practitioners who spoke about this norm against the use of mercenaries. In 1998, Kofi Annan gave a famous speech in which he publicly discussed the possibility of using private military companies to carry out humanitarian interventions. So in case UN member states again would fail to muster the political will to intervene, for example, in grave cases such as impending genocides. But Annan in 1998 concluded, quote, "The world is not ready to privatize peace," unquote. Now, fast forward to 2003. During the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003, private military companies and their employees constituted the second largest member of the US's so-called coalition of the willing. The numbers had increased tenfold in Iraq as compared to the first Gulf War in the early 1990s. It's estimated that up to 170 different private military companies were operating in Iraq, employing tens of thousands of contractors. In Afghanistan, meanwhile, the situation was even more extreme. After the US invasion of 2002, more contractors were present than US soldiers. So today, the private military company business is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So arms expenditures in general are rising. Despite COVID, there's an increase in arms expenditures, and the mercenary industry is no exception. Some of the numbers are quite staggering. So I'll just give you one little example. According to several sources, the US paid one private military company $1 billion to train the police force of Afghanistan. So it's a very lucrative business, and private security services and private military companies are literally everywhere. Right? So from shopping malls to the reception of Leiden University, they run prisons, they run police receptions, they train armed forces, engage in security sector reform, they guard CEOs, they guard diplomats, they guard NGOs, they guard journalists. So why this stark reversal over the relatively short period of time? Why did some people argue that in the 1990s, real states don't use mercenaries, and just 25 years later, now these services are ordered off the menu like poffertjes? So I think there's a combination of several factors, and that's the last point that I wanted to make before I hand over. So it's obviously a combination of various factors that combine to explain that stark reversal over a short period of time. One, I think, is the macro trend of power diffusion. So we see a general fundamental trend of power diffusion away from nation states towards non-state actors. This includes even individuals. Right? Think about what technology and globalization have empowered individuals. Right? So literally some dude in his mom's basement, if clever enough, can hack into the Pentagon or hack into a large private company, just using the power of the brain and technology. The same we can see with the empowerment of other non-state actors. Think about transnational criminal cartels or terrorist groups. So we see a general power diffusion, and the rise of private military companies is part of that macro trend. Also important ideological shifts. So the power diffusion that I've just talked about, it happens in part because governments let it happen, but it also happens partly because governments actively promote the diffusion of power. So think about powerful governments like the US or the UK, who have subscribed to what we can call sort of a neoliberal ideology. So since the 1970s, ideals have changed and market-based solutions have become more attractive. To some, market-based solutions are the holy grail. They're good in and of themselves. And of course, that then makes it much easier to conceive of the privatization of force and the outsourcing and commodification of security.
Thank you very much, Hebel. I'm really afraid we have to leave things there.
Thank you.
We're really grateful for you illuminating first introductory statement, and thank you very much for setting the scene. And I would like to give the floor to Mcfade to continue with his introductory talk right now.
Thank you. First of all, can everybody hear me? Okay. I'm going to build on Kai's excellent beginning here, and my task is in 10 minutes, if you can believe it, to sort of discuss what's the situation look like today, and where might this trend be heading in the future. So I'll start by saying that, as you know, as Kai has just discussed, since the 1990s, the reappearance of private military force has been a gradual but increasing trend for the past 30 years. And one of my colleagues, who's actually in the audience today, is David Eisenberg in the United States, who has been tracking this industry for about 30 years too. And the market has gone from, we all know from the 1990s, from executive outcomes in South Africa, to a monopoly when America, was the sugar daddy, if you will, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And anybody who wanted to be part of this business went to find American contracts, and there were a lot. But and they're not all just Americans. These companies, these private military companies that were used by the United States, at their top leadership, they were all American, usually former military, ex-generals, but in the middle and bottom ranks, they were from all over the world. And I say that as somebody who was amongst that rank. I was a middle manager for a company, and I did other things after that. But that's called a monopoly. We have one major buyer and a lot of suppliers. And the major buyer can use market power to sort of create the rules of the road, although the United States of America really failed to do so during the Iraq and Afghan wars. And as the United States left those wars, well, the United States of America made the very bad assumption that private military actors act like cheap army reservists. So like after World War II, they just go home and reintegrate as civilians into, society. But that's not what these creatures do. They are profit maximizing business entities. And so now in the last 10 years, we've seen the market diversify, and we've seen it become a true free market for force. It's approaching gradually a pre-Westphalian market, the type of market that Machiavelli was talking about. It's not there yet, but that's the trend line. And we can talk in detail about Machiavelli's biases, but the point is that, mercenaries are the second oldest profession. Most of military history is private military history, and it fundamentally changes war when you separate nation states from warfare, which is happening as we speak. Because suddenly, market strategies blend with military ones. Think of Clausewitz meets Adam Smith. And our generals today, and our national security establishments today, and our bureaucracies and our militaries fundamentally do not understand how this is changing warfare. And this is very dangerous. Now, why are we seeing a proliferation of mercenaries in the world? And I'll take a break for a second and say that, in my opinion, and others in the panel may disagree, there's no bright line between a mercenary and a private military contractor, right? I mean, and what I mean by private military contractor, I'm actually not talking about security guards. I'm thinking about trigger pullers, traditional mercenaries who go to foreign wars mainly for profit and deploy force in a military manner. And if the truth is, if you can work for Blackwater, which is a private military company, according to the United States of America, you can also become a mercenary. The only difference is the will of the individual and market circumstances. There's no bright line between mercenaries and the lethal part of the private military industry. So why are people hiring mercenaries? It's obviously anybody who has money, who can swipe a check, can wage war for any reason they want, no matter how petty. Some of the reasons, as Jay has mentioned, is that the stigma against mercenaries is fading. Another reason for big countries like Russia and United States to hire these PMCs / mercenaries or UAE is that you can have bloodless wars, at least not with your blood. So Russia and United States have very casualty risk-averse societies. They do not want to see their soldiers coming home in body bags. They don't care about contractors. So domestic politicians like Putin or Bush or Obama can wage wars overseas without having to pay a domestic political price for casualties. So it lowers the barriers of entry. Even though that Russia and the United States have very capable militaries, it allows them to wage wars bloodlessly. It also, and this is very important, it also gives, mercenaries give plausible deniability. And this is a trend of modern war that many people don't think about. We live in an information age. And in an information age, weapons that give you plausible deniability are more valuable than raw firepower. Because, you know, think about how Russia took Ukraine. They could have blitzkrieged in there and taken it, but it would have galvanized international community against them. Instead, they created a ghost occupation force, a special forces, mercenaries like the Wagner Group, Little Green Men, others, who created a fog of war. And then while the West was still trying to figure out what was going on in that fog of war, the Crimea was a fait accompli. So modern warfare is getting sneakier, and mercenaries are a chief weapon system to profit from modern war. They also offer niche abilities, like in 2015, Nigeria, which couldn't deal with Boko Haram for 6 years, secretly hired mercenaries to help them push up Boko Haram. They did so in a matter of weeks. So where is this all going? Well, we're going to see it grow. I mean, Libya today is like a mercenary conflict. We're going back not to a pre-Westphalian age, but to normal. World history has always seen private military history. It's very rare that one political entity, like a state, can monopolize the market for force. So we're going back to normal. And what does this mean? It means that anybody who's rich enough can wage war for any reason they want. ExxonMobil someday may get a private military. A mega church, which have a lot of money, might hire private, mercenaries to do humanitarian intervention. There's really nothing to stop this. International law is, in my opinion, cannot stop this, because who's going to go into Libya and arrest all those mercenaries? The United Nations? NATO? No. And also, those mercenaries can kill your law enforcement dead. So this is an industry that literally resists arrest. And this is why it's never, with the exception of the past 150 years, the market has never been monopolized. So I think going into the middle of the 21st century, we should see a rise of this industry. It's been on a steady growth pattern since 1990. I see no reason why that will change, as much as I would like it to change. But I think we need to prepare for private warfare. When private entities wage wars and states are prizes to be won, not driving warfare, but booty of warfare, as we already see in Sub-Saharan Africa and in narco wars in Latin America. And I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mcfade. I think that was a very illuminating statement, and I think we also have some nice points for discussion in the discussion statements. And I would very much like to give the floor to Dr. Aparak to give the point of view from the United Nations Human Rights Council and address the issue of international law.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for inviting me to speak with such an interesting panel. And I'd like to hope to bring some positive views on what was just said, because there was kind of like quite a lot of scary and negative points, which are not far from truth. But I think that we also have to look at the bright side, and hopefully we can we can see the bright side. As you said, I am the chair rapporteur of the working group on the use of mercenaries. And I'll say only once the full title of the group. So the working group on the use of mercenaries as means of violating human rights and impeding the exercise of the right of peoples to self-determination. That's the full title of our working group, and we refer to it as the working group on the use of mercenaries in a short. And we were established by the Human Rights Council in 2005, at the time when the concerns about operations of private military and security companies in Iraq and Afghanistan were in worldwide media, including in terms of the human rights abuses. We are mandated by the Human Rights Council to monitor and study the effects of mercenaries, mercenary-related activities, and private military and security companies. And we have distinguished between the three categories of actors that we therefore under our mandate. And we monitor in particular on the enjoyment of human rights and in humanitarian law. The working group is part of the so-called special procedures, and it's established by the UN Human Rights Council, which is of course the body composed of states. But we are 5 members of the working group from different region and different expertise, not all lawyers, and we are not UN staff. We work independently to highlight specific human rights issues on the topic that fall under our mandate. We are not an investigative body. I think it's very important to highlight that. We have some tools that are at our disposal to effectively execute our mandate. One of those tools is the annual thematic reports. We present 2 annual reports per year, one to the Human Rights Council in Geneva and one to the General Assembly in New York. That's usually towards the end of the year. And so far in the last few years, we have studied through those thematic reports the specific relationship between extractive industry and private military and security companies, the PMCs, where we highlighted that extractive industry is actually one of the main clients of PMCs today, comparing to the situation of Afghanistan and Iraq time in the early 2000. That has changed, so it's not the state, the main client anymore. So we wanted to highlight this non-state client basis between 2 types of companies under international law. We also studied the gendered impact of the PMCs, given that it's a very male-dominated industry, as I see also with the participants and the panel today, and the impact of this industry on women, whether they're being recruited by the PMCs or whether they are being the victims of PMCs' conduct in terms of, for example, the sexual violence and discrimination against women and female land human rights defenders. We have also studied in the report that we presented last year the role of PMCs in the border management and migrant detention, which is one of the contexts that are particularly important for our study to present the cases of non-armed conflict situations where PMCs are really growing, and some of the panelists already said that the markets are expanding and PMCs are not operating only in the context of armed conflict, but also with the terrorist attacks for example, in France after the terrorist attacks in 2015, they were literally mushrooming the private security to guard shops, universities, train stations, etc. But also the migrant detention and border management and the use of technology in this context as well. And in our last report, we have analyzed the evolving trends of mercenaries and the PMCs. We've highlighted some of the issues. I'll come back to that. We are currently studying the cyber mercenaries and how the issue of cyber mercenaries would fall within the traditional definition of mercenaries, and what are the growing trends and how the private mercenaries are evolving. We also have a tool that we use is the system of communication. That's the system of allegation letters, where we have victims or victims' representatives bringing allegations of human rights violations to our attention. And we then bring it to the attention of states, given that the state is the prime responsible for ensuring the respect of human rights. But one thing that is very important within the context of communications under the special procedures is that we can also address companies. And we effectively do in different contexts, whether it is the issue of companies operating in conflict zones, such as Libya or Nagorno-Karabakh or Central African Republic, which were some of the recent allegation letters that we raised, but also whether they operate within the context of migrant detention and human rights abuses towards unaccompanied minors in the detention, for example. Not all of our allegation letters are accompanied by press releases, and not necessarily do we always act with the allegation letter in order to issue a press release. So for example, you have perhaps followed that we, towards the end of December 2020, we issued a press release, which is very short, straight to the point, that the pardon of former President Donald Trump to the former Blackwater was the violation of international law. And that was actually a very well received by the media and by different actors and stakeholders. In addition to our mandate to monitor human rights abuses, we are also very active in long-standing efforts to regulate private military and security industry, to develop and enforce measures designed to both prevent but also to ensure accountability for human rights abuses committed by PMC's personnel. And in this regard, from 2010 to 2017, we participated in several annual sessions of the open-ended intergovernmental working group that was mandated by the Human Rights Council, but this is the interstate governmental working group that was mandated to consider the possibility of elaborating the international regulatory framework on PMCs. And the working group concluded that there should be the follow-up to this work. We, as the working group on mercenaries, we contributed with our statements and submissions to the discussions for the respective delegations that were contributing to the intergovernmental working group. We have now also contributed to the new intergovernmental working group that is now mandated to consider the content of the future regulatory regime independently of its nature. So we don't know yet if it's going to be a treaty or something else, but regardless of the future legal nature of the instrument, the states are discussing the content, and we contributed in the first session and in the second session that took place just last week between the states. And I, as a chair, brought an expert statement to the delegations where I highlighted some of the important aspects that we believe should be included in the future regulatory regime. And some of those aspects are that state and non-state actors should generally refrain from the use and recruitment of PMCs and their personnel, in particular when there is an increased risk for human rights and IHL abuses. We also ask that states should consider not to outsource activities that constitute direct participation in hostilities, which is reflecting, of course, the armed conflict context. We also highlighted that the regulatory mechanism should try to capture non-state clients and the complex relationship, and it should be also the gender-sensitive and gender-transformative approach. And we thought that states should recognize the exacerbated vulnerabilities of specific groups and include explicit provisions on the protection of migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, as well as human rights and environmental defenders. They should consider children as right holders and address the cases where children are recruited and used by PMCs. And we, of course, included the issue of environment, and in particular in the context of today, militarization and climate change. Where do we stand today, and how we're looking for where we're looking forward, how we think the situation will develop? In our last report to the General Assembly that I mentioned on evolving trends of mercenaries, we looked into the detail on the changing changes of that are marking the contemporary armed conflicts, and how these changes are bearing on the forms and manifestations of mercenary and mercenary-related activities. And we thought, we stated in our report that those activities have evolved in parallel with the considerable change in the nature of conduct of warfare, as my co-panelists already mentioned, so I'm not going to go into the detail. But among the determined trends, I would like to bring to your attention that we have seen the increased demand for mercenaries-related actors in contemporary armed conflict, increase in non-international armed conflicts, so that's interstate, the civil wars, as to say it vulgarly, proliferation of armed non-state actors, involvement of third parties in situations of armed conflicts, and asymmetry between parties to the conflict and military capabilities and strategies. And I'll conclude with this, that one of the key messages from our work report is that the great variety of multitude of actors involved in contemporary armed conflicts share some characteristics with mercenaries, but they are not necessarily falling within the rigid international legal definitions of mercenary. And that makes it very challenging to address their activities and related human rights implications in a very cohesive measure. And we believe this is something that's likely to continue with the increased use of technology and development of cyber capabilities. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jelena Parak, for your very illuminating introductory statement. And we are a bit over time, but it doesn't really matter because we have now a very nice bridge into the panel discussion as you address the point of regulation of private military companies. And I think you expressed an interesting point of view over there. So would the other panelists and be willing to react to what can and should be done to regulate behavior? Do you think that a few points that were just expressed are feasible, or should other steps be undertaken? Perhaps I could give the word to Mcfade.
Sure. I mean, I think that Elena and I diverge a bit on the potential of international law to curb this industry. I think it's important work, don't get me wrong. I just think that one of the reasons we see countries like Russia and Nigeria use mercenaries is because they afford the client plausible deniability, so they're not going to self-report that. And in fact, they may hire them to do things that are human rights violations that they don't want their own military doing. So for like messy counterinsurgency operations. And that's the real target of regulation. It's not so much Wackenhut or others. The very worst actors really we cannot reach, but that doesn't make the effort to broaden international law, the laws are in conflict, it doesn't make it worthwhile, because I think they need to be updated desperately.
Thank you. Would Dr. Hebel be willing to comment on this issue?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much, Jelena, for your talk, and Sean as well. Very thought-provoking. So I think before I talk about regulation, I would like to address what Sean has, I think, very rightly highlighted, which is the political rationale that underlies the logic, so to speak. Right? It's political logic that ultimately leads governments to use or not use the services of private military companies. So before you regulate, I think there is a more fundamental debate to be had, and I'm very glad that this event is taking place, as it can be part of that debate, which is about the the extensiveness of interventionism. Right? So I mean, if you look at the appalling track record of Western intervention, just think Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. Right? So I think there needs to be a domestic debate in all the most powerful states, the US, UK, the Netherlands, all of the NATO states, about the role that external intervention should play in their security strategies. Because at the moment, and Sean has very nicely highlighted that political dynamic, at the moment, the use of PMCs allows governments to have their cake and eat it. They can still meddle, intervene extensively abroad, but they have sort of this shadow, the veneer of plausible deniability. So I think the more fundamental debate is really about how much to meddle, how much to intervene. My own personal take on this, and I'm sure others will disagree, is that less intervention is more. Right? We should meddle far less and do the meddling that we do far better than what we're currently doing. So this is a more fundamental point on the supply side, so to speak, or the need to hire these contractors. Now, last point on the global south, right? It's different in the global south, right? If you're a government under siege in a weak state, right, then the dynamics are different. So then we're talking about Nigeria, we're talking about Sierra Leone and other cases. But as Sean has highlighted, the sugar daddy really is the US and other powerful and wealthy countries. So I think if the debate there, that we need a debate there. And you can see a division even within states. So think about the United Kingdom. The Defense Ministry of the United Kingdom does not use PMCs, but the Foreign Office of the United Kingdom does. Right? So there's an ongoing debate, and it's far from certain where the future is going to go. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your contribution. And then I'm curious as to know whether Dr. Aparak would like to comment to these two rather negative views on the topic.
Yes, I mean, I personally, I do agree to some extent to the situation, and I think the market is really expanding. And one thing that we are being very realistic within the working group is that we will not eliminate the use of mercenaries or the PMCs. And I'm not going to go into the definition, which is also one of the reasons why the regulatory framework is not moving forward as it should be. But that's a legal discussion on the definition, as legal scholars like to do. But one thing that we do see is that there has to be the combination of the political will with the legislative frameworks that accompany that political will. And we have studied, recently we conducted a study over 60 states, including some of the main states, but around the globe, global south, the global north. And what we have seen that is the domestic legislation is very patchy and inconsistent. And of course, it's not enough. There has to be certification, vetting, both at the home state and the operating state. There is the lack of oversight mechanism, regulatory mechanism, and the domestic legislation should be in line with the international human rights standards, but also hopefully one day regulatory framework that we in the working group hope will be international treaty, but that's still not on the discussion table yet. So we know the market is expanding, and we've seen it. And in the report on the migrant detention, that was really, really important aspect, how the lobby of PMCs is actually influencing states to say, well, actually, migrants are the issue of national security and national threat, whereas they are vulnerable groups, according to us. And so they managed to convince states to adopt legislations and frameworks that will allow PMCs operating in those contexts. We have addressed the situations on the Mexico-US border, privatization of migrant detention, that again is not an armed conflict, but it is, in our migrant report, we've said it's a multi-billion industry, just the management of the migration. So again, there are several issues to take into account, and of course, political will with the legal framework has to go hand to hand.
Thank you very much for this contribution. And while you were discussing this statement, I saw some questions coming up in the chat. Thank you very much for sending them in. We will be addressing them in around 8 minutes, but keep sending them. And I think another very interesting panel discussion statement is that of the role of hiring PMCs for peacekeeping operations. Because as Dr. Hebo already addressed, in Kofi Annan's speech, he said the world wasn't ready for it by then. But the big question, is the world ready right now in 2021 to resort to hiring vetted PMCs personnel to prevent humanitarian disasters if member states are not willing to provide military forces when an intervention is required, and if there is international consensus on an intervention? And I would like to give the floor to Kai Hebel to kick off.
Well, you can always call on a professor. We'll never not talk, so it's a safe bet. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, the change that we have seen since Kofi Annan's statement in 1998. Right? So if you read the speech, which I recommend people do, you can see how torn he was on that subject, because on the one hand, he clearly saw the need for intervention in grave cases of human rights breaches and brewing genocides, the problem from hell, as Samantha Power has aptly called it. But on the other hand, he did understand that there was still this strong anti-mercenary norm. And I want to slightly disagree with Sean here. If I understood you correctly, Sean, I don't think the norm is dying or has died. It might smell a little funny, but I think it has been adapted. And you can see this also in the actions of PMCs and in their rhetoric. So one way in which they have tried to adapt to this norm is to differentiate between defensive deployments and offensive actions. Right? There are companies out there who say we don't engage in actual combat operations, we do other things. Right? We train forces, for example. I know, Sean, you've written about security sector reform very eloquently. So I think the norm is still there. And also we can feel this, I think, in the public debate. There is an unease still among many citizens about the thought of privatizing violence and commodifying security. The UN, though, has moved forward, right? The UN is increasingly open to using contractors. That's my reading of the situation. Jelena, please disagree with me on this. But I do think the UN has moved significantly from 1998. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your contribution. And I'm also really curious as to give the floor to Ms. Dr. Aparak, because it must be kind of complicating matter when you're advising for the United Nations, and it must be very complex on the international law if you would allow the UN to hire PMCs themselves.
Yes, yes, and I think this is so. I'm in the working group since 2018, and previously the former members had the same feeling as you do have now, and as we do, the current members. And they said, well, if we're going to work on the use of PMCs, let's start from our own house. Let's see from how the UN actually treats this topic. And in 2014, the working group presented a report on the use of PMCs by UN. Not just the peacekeeping mission, but different entities within the UN, with, of course, the main focus on the peacekeeping missions, given that this is where the increased need for the security. So there are some aspects from the report that I can read you. That in 2009, the UN instituted the policy, which was the shift in the security management from when to leave to how to stay approach. And this was supposed to help UN to comply with their mandates and activities in a highly challenging security situations. And so this report in 2014 examined the use of United Nations of private military and security companies in light of the vast and complex challenges with the outsourcing security and private military and security companies. So the United Nations reliance on the use of private security companies has increased in recent years. But on the positive side, the report was actually a very good way to engage with the DPKO and different entities to promote the good practices and to develop the detailed guidelines and policies on how to recruit security companies. So today we have policies in place that are clearly set for it should be the last resort policy to recruit private security companies. And it should only recruit the companies that are certificated by the ICOCA, the International Code of Conduct Association for Private Security Providers. And of course, there should be some vetting on the use of, on the personnel if they have been accused of human rights allegations in different contexts. This is not perfect. And today we see that there are still lots of challenges with regards to the relationship between the UN and PMCs. And you may have been following our recent press release that accompanied the allegation letter. Allegation letter will be public in about 20 days, I think, in relations to Central African Republic. So I cannot go into details on the allegation letter yet, but I can just repeat what we said in the press release. We have seen the different companies and entities operating in Central African Republic, namely Wagner, Seva, and Lobe Invest. They're intertwined in their own operations, including directly participating in hostilities and armed conflict, with the very grave impact on human rights abuses and IHL violations. And unfortunately, what we've seen in this context was that there was also the interoperability with the peacekeeping mission in Central African Republic. We are hoping to clarify this. We asked different actors that we addressed through allegation letters to clarify what are the legal bases of different actors, the contractual relationships, the mandates, and we think this is something that is recurrent problem in different contexts, whether it's extractive industry, whether it's the migration, whether it's the peacekeeping. It's very repetitive, lack of transparency, lack of access to information, and most importantly, lack of accountability.
Thank you very much.
We'll see.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but would like to wrap up the panel discussion itself. But before we do that, I would like to give the floor to Mcfade for the last statement on hiring PMCs for peacekeeping operations and through the UN.
Yeah, I've long been an advocate for doing this. I think Kofi Annan engaged in a huge moral failure in 1998 on his world is not ready for peacekeeping. He was talking about the Rwanda genocide when executive outcomes offered to help out, which they could have done potentially great work to save lots of lives. And he said, no, the world's not ready for peacekeeping, but the world wasn't ready for 900,000 people to be killed either. And that is why Kofi Annan can never go back to Rwanda, to be blunt about it. So I think the UN, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, whatever it's called now, it seems to be a no-brainer. They have thinning blue helmet ranks. They need to, they need more blue helmets. You've got an industry who wants to help out, who can. If the United Nations can put together a vetting regime, an accountability, transparency regime, and frankly, much of it has already been established, as Yelena was talking about this, by this organization in Geneva called the International Code of Conduct Association Organization. It's a mixture of PMCs, companies, countries, and they're trying to establish the norms. So it's already in existence. The question is, can the UN do it? And I think the time is nigh. If you think about what are the moral consequences if we don't do it, right? I mean, does Somalia, CAR, Libya, do they continue to burn and fester, grizzling up and eating human lives? It is possible to do it, but the only thing that's getting in the way is this stigma, which to me is a very expensive and amoral ideology. That's a strong words, but I think we have to consider that.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Dr. Mcfade. And I'm afraid we have to wrap up the panel discussion there, but we will now open the floor to the Q&A. And I would like to ask Paul van het Hoen. You typed a very interesting question in the chat, and whether you are willing to ask that yourself. And if you have any specific panelist you would like to answer it. If you're not willing, then it's also fine, then we'll just go on. But basically what he asked is how do we need to interpret the use of PMCs on mercenaries by nations that in a name support a rule-based order, because there seems to be a contradiction with potential catastrophic consequences. So could I give the floor to Mcfade again?
Sure, I agree with Paul that you know, the United States of America calls Blackwater a private military company because they have anti-mercenary domestic laws in the books. Russia calls the Wagner Group a private military company because they have, you know, anti-mercenary domestic laws in the books. Cynicism seems to be the watchword of the day when it comes to big powers, hegemonic powers, especially using this industry. How we confront that is a different question, Paul. But I essentially agree with you that it's a huge problem, and I don't see a clear solution.
Thank you. And then we have an interesting question about regulation and possibility to hold states accountable by Nina Hübner. I'm wondering if you're willing to ask your question yourself.
Yes, hello. I was just wondering, because you guys talked about, or specifically Dr. Aparak talked about, how domestic legislation is ineffective in providing like sort of a channel for recourse. And I'm doing research on this right now, and I was wondering if you're familiar with the doctrine of state responsibility, or more generally, if it would be possible to assign responsibility to the hiring state instead, and not the PMC, for any human rights violations.
I think this question is very well fit for Mrs. Aparak.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the state doctrine responsibility, of course, applies whether every time the states, when we can attribute the acts of the PMCs to a state, whether the home state or the state of operation, the state host state. But one thing that we want to look into is the limitation of the state doctrine, which is why we analyzed the specific relationship and the client-based approach, where PMCs operate not only in the classical sense that was in Afghanistan and Iraq. This is not the scenario anymore, and I think Sean explained this very well today. It's a very diversified client base and diversified contexts and operations. So the state doctrine does not necessarily apply for example, if PMCs are operating with the non-state armed groups, or if they are operating with extractive industries. I can refer you to our report on extractive industry and the contractual relationships and the complexity of the contractual relationship, which are all legal, to be honest. So when there are no legal relationship, how do you apply the state doctrine responsibility? But of course, if there is a way to apply the state doctrine, then of course states, both home and host states, can be held responsible. Of course, which way normally it should be International Court of Justice, but other possibilities are going to be open. But it's not the only possibility. Individuals can be also held criminally responsible, and we have seen the only case that we had was actually in the domestic proceedings with the four former Blackwater employees, and that was that ended up with the pardon. So unfortunately, even there we are very limited in terms of responsibility. I mean, there are lots of other issues we can discuss, but you can reach out to me privately if there is more for your master thesis.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aparak, for your clarifying answer. And then we have an interesting question by Benses Sabo. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And I'm wondering whether you're willing to ask your question regarding the role of Europe and the potential of PMCs operating in that context.
Yes, sure. Can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Okay, so this is an open-ended question, and what I'm curious about this is that nowadays internal terrorism activities are just so prevalent and so hard to combat, and the masterminds also spoke their minds in the context of using PMCs as a cover for the governments. Can this be a regular practice in the future, that more and more PMCs come forward, for example, to combat the COVID unrests in the future, or can they be used as an internal police force? What do you think about that? Thank you.
Dr. Hebel, perhaps?
Well, I think the answer depends to some extent how cynical we are about those in power using that cover. So It's not impossible. In Europe, I'd be surprised if we saw that in Europe, because the domestic constraints, legal, but also in terms of public opinion, are still quite high. Like I said earlier, there is this unease about privatizing, outsourcing core functions of the state and give it into the hands of someone who does it for profit rather than out of a sense of duty to the country, to the national interest, to the citizenry. So I'm skeptical about this happening, but it's not an impossibility.
Thank you very much for your answer. The next interesting question is from Marnix Middelburg. Are you willing to ask your question yourself?
Yeah, I am. And I think it would be nice if Mcfade could answer, because I think he wrote about this in his book as well. It's whether the contracting of PMC would be a very different discussion when looking at the strength of the actor that contracts them. So, for example, weak and fragile states are more likely to suffer negative consequences of contracting PMCs than strong states or than legitimate intergovernmental organizations. And should that not be more highlighted when discussing these kind of things? Who uses them, to what end, and what capacities do they have to regulate the behavior that they wish to see from the PMCs?
I think you raise a great point, Pmcs, is that when we look at who's hiring, the demand side of this equation, it kind of right now breaks down into three groups. There are strong states like Russia and the United States. There are rich, weak states like the UAE, to some extent Nigeria, and then there are non-state actors like the Fortune 500 and super rich folks, and maybe someday NGOs. And I think there are different ways to, frankly, compel better behavior. Obviously, when you're dealing with Russia, it's probably the hardest to move, but maybe that's not where we start. Some things that we could do, and this is why I think Elena's work is so important, is that we need to update international law to, even if it's not effective on the ground all the time, it reestablishes norms. The second thing is that, big users like the United Nations, if they started to hire these folks, they can create, with their market power, they can create norms, enforce norms. Third, ICOA, ICOCA can get in the way between the demand curve and the supply curve to just sort of allow the, well-respected PMCs, quote unquote, and then name and shame. And I think naming and shaming is really important, because that is something that, big powers, media and others can lean on, UAE, like, why are they in Libya? If mercenaries offer plausible deniability, can you create implausible deniability through exposure, which is actually what the UN did last year, which I thought was fantastic, in Libya. So I think that we have to think about what tools are available to compel behavior, and I think we need to be creative about it, not just look at one tool like international law or international organizations, but create a much more broader Catholic view of it.
Thank you very much. I'm curious as to know whether Dr. Aparak would like to comment on this.
Yes, I mean, we are talking about international law and PMCs, but I just realized that we actually didn't mention what are the rules about PMCs. And in fact, there are three, in terms of the norms, there are three international legal definitions on what is mercenary. One is in the International Humanitarian Law, Article 47 of the Additional Protocol 1, that is applicable only to international armed conflicts. And as you may remember, I said most of the conflicts today are civil wars, non-international armed conflicts. So this definition does not apply in most of the conflicts today. The second one is the UN Convention from '89 that also provides definition of the mercenary, and it's ratified by very few states, so it doesn't apply in most of the contexts today. And the third definition is in the only regional instrument that we have is the African Convention on Mercenaries. These are the only three definitions that we have today that are on the international level, international law definition, and they talk only about mercenaries. The international humanitarian law does not refer to PMCs at all because they emerged after the Geneva Convention were adopted, well after the additional protocols to the Geneva Convention. So there are no legal rules in international law today that refer to PMCs. So when we talk about international law, we have to be also bear in mind that there is no international law to regulate PMCs at all. We only have two instruments today. That's the Montreux document from 2008 that was under the Swiss initiative, and that is a non-binding document. It's a voluntary initiative. And 2010, that's the International Code of Conduct. That's under the association, ICOCA. It refers only to private security and the complex environments. And the Montreux document refers only to armed conflicts. So it doesn't regulate, for example, maritime security, doesn't regulate the issue of migrant detention and border management and everything that's peace related. So when we talk about the expansion of PMCs and how they are growing in the markets, we have to bear in mind that they are not being regulated. So we can't say international law doesn't work because there is no international law to regulate PMCs, but we are working towards it, so we have to be positive anyway. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aparak, for this very clarifying point. I'm afraid we're almost at the time. Time is almost up, but I think there's still time for one more question. And I don't know if is Jacco van der Veen present. You sent in a question about Mozambique and whether the failure of PMCs there is merely anecdotal. And I think this is a very good question to end because we somehow taken it for granted that PMCs will continue and will keep rising. And I think, would you like to ask a question yourself?
Yeah, I am present, but you basically already asked my question. It's the situation in Cabo Delgado. And I think it shows the limitations of the use of PMCs. And yeah, I think Mr. Mcfade would be perhaps a good person to answer it because he was very much talking about how this will be a continuing, striving and steady growth process. So maybe he can shed some light on it.
Yeah, thank you, Jacco. And that's a good point, is that Wagner Group, which is this Russian PMC mercenary group, their badass stock has been falling recently because, you know, they did all these things in Ukraine and Syria, and people are like, oh my goodness, but you don't know war until you go to Africa, in my opinion. And it's a continent with the most conflict, and people tend to underestimate it because they don't see F-35s, but that's, you know, it's a tragic mistake. So Wagner Group has suffered, has frankly failed to a large degree in Mozambique as well as in Libya. And we should not, and I don't want to give the impression that mercenaries are going to, you know, they're going to take over the world and we're going to go to like Mad Max and the Thunderdome. That's not my point of view. There are limitations. But also Mozambique hired other mercenaries to go in there from the Executive Outcomes Alumni Network. And one thing that we have to remember, this is a marketplace. This is not World War II strategy. It changes warfare in some pretty profound ways. And we have to be savvy to seeing how this works, because also there's a lot of ways to defeat mercenaries that are not what conventional warriors think about. That's a topic for another time, but I just want to say one thing. One of the reasons why I think Dr. Yelena's work is so important, because I don't want to give the impression that international law is useless, is that it helps steer states to think about this issue more closely. So in the United States of America, the CIA, for example, doesn't really think about mercenaries. They're thinking about terrorists, Russia, China, and Iran, and that's kind of it. By talking about this in the context of international law, it puts it on their so-called radar. And I think that would make the world a safer place just by doing that alone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mcfade. I'm afraid time is almost up, but I would like to give the floor to Dr. Hebel and wonder if he wishes to make a last brief concluding remark regarding this last question.
Thank you. I'd like to conclude on a general note, if I may. So I think the topic is fascinating and important for lots of reasons. One is that we see the intersection between politics, security/military issues, and the law, right? And they interact in important ways, and all these three aspects are important. But ultimately, I would see it fundamentally, we're talking about political equations that state and non-state actors are making, whether or not to use the services. So I would conclude on these two political points. One is about the definition of the national interest, right? And I think there's a lot of muddled thinking in many countries about what they're trying to do, right? So as the German defense minister once said, German security is defended in Afghanistan. Is that really a feasible definition of national security, expanding the national security interest thousands and thousands of miles away? So my call would be for a minimalist understanding of national security requirements, really cutting the interests to the bone. What is it that we're actually, what is it that is vital to national security? There are a lot of things that are desirable to national security. There are only a few things that are vital. And that distinction has become increasingly blurred. And my final point is the risk of using PMCs is it, as Sean and the other have also elaborated, the risk is to further blur the line between what is a vital national security interest and what's a desirable national security goal. And that dividing line is fundamental to any strategy. You have limited instruments, limited resources. You have to use them well. And it starts with a proper definition. What's the vital national security interest? PMCs are very tempting because they help politicians to blur the line between the vital and the desirable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hebel, for this excellent concluding remark. And I would like to apologize for going over time a little bit, but I would like to thank the participants very, very much that Dr. Aparak, Dr. Mcfade, and Dr. Hebel are willing to make the time available and are willing to share their thoughts. And lastly, I would also like to thank you, the audience, for attending this panel discussion today and asking these great questions. So thank you all for participating, and thank you for joining this event by the Netherlands Atlantic Youth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.